There are few documents that have generated as much speculation on the internet as the Adam and Eve story. For years, videos, websites, and social media posts have repeated the same basic claim, that the CIA supposedly classified the book because it revealed a hidden truth about Earth's past. According to those stories, the document described a recurring global catastrophe so significant that governments wanted to keep it secret. Some versions claim it predicts the next civilization-ending event. Others suggest it explains the disappearance of ancient cultures, the biblical flood, Atlantis, or even the origins of humanity itself. As often happens online, the story has grown larger with each retelling. But before asking whether the book's claims are true, there are a few more fundamental questions that should probably be asked. What exactly is this document? Who wrote it? Why does the CIA possess a copy? And perhaps most importantly, does possessing a document mean the government endorses its conclusions? Throughout this podcast, we've examined declassified intelligence programs, Cold War research, surveillance systems, and historical events that have attracted considerable public attention. And one lesson has appeared repeatedly, that the existence of a document is not by itself evidence that its contents are true, because as we've seen over and over, governments frequently archive enormous amounts of material. Intelligence agencies collect books, newspapers, technical manuals, scientific papers, and foreign publications from around the world. Some become classified because of where they're stored. Others are declassified decades later. Neither classification nor declassification automatically validates the information inside, and that's an important distinction, because rather than examining the mythology surrounding the Adam and Eve story, we're going to examine the document itself. We'll explore what the author actually argued, where those ideas intersect with modern science and religion, and why this relatively obscure text continues to capture the imagination of readers decades after it was written. Although often described simply as a book about pole shifts or global catastrophes, the Adam and Eve story is actually much broader. The author attempts to build a single framework connecting geology, archaeology, religion, mythology, linguistics, and human history into one explanation for the rise and fall of civilization. Like many subjects we've explored, the goal is not to tell you what to believe, it's to separate documented history from speculation and speculation from evidence.
You're listening to the Partisan Comms Podcast.
There is a signal broadcast every second of every day through our television sets.
Welcome to episode 28. I'm Terrence. The author of the Adam and Eve story was Chan Thomas, an engineer and researcher with an interest in geology, earth science, religion, and the long history of human civilization. Originally published during the 1960s, the book proposed an ambitious explanation for many of history's greatest mysteries. Thomas argued that Earth experiences periodic global cataclysms that repeatedly destroy civilizations before they can fully preserve their knowledge. According to his interpretation, human history is not a continuous upward progression. Instead, civilization repeatedly rises, collapses, and begins again. Over time, many of Thomas's ideas became overshadowed by the story surrounding the book itself. In recent years, the internet has increasingly described the Adam and Eve story as a suppressed CIA document, and that description deserves careful examination, because the CIA did possess a copy, and it eventually appeared within the agency's declassified records, but intelligence agencies maintain enormous archives containing books and technical reports, newspapers, foreign publications, academic papers, and countless other materials collected for reference purposes. Owning a copy of the document is not the same as endorsing its conclusions, nor does declassification imply government validation. And that difference is often lost in online discussions. Once a document bears a government stamp or appears within an intelligence archive, many people instinctively assume it carries official authority. In reality, archives often preserve documents precisely because analysts found them interesting, unusual, or relevant to ongoing research, even if they ultimately disagreed with their conclusions. And I think recognizing that approach allows us to look at Thomas's work more objectively. Rather than asking whether the CIA believed the book, we can ask a more useful question, which is, what was Thomas attempting to explain? And his answer was remarkably ambitious. He sought to connect several fields of study, such as geology and archaeology, mythology, religion, paleontology, astronomy, and human history into a single unified framework. Whether readers ultimately agree with his conclusions is almost secondary, because the intellectual scope of the project itself explains why the book continues attracting attention. Thomas was attempting to answer one of humanity's oldest questions, which is, why do civilizations disappear? Throughout this episode, we'll examine how he answered that question, where his arguments align with established observations, where they might diverge from scientific consensus, and why his work continues to occupy a unique place in discussions about ancient catastrophes and lost civilizations. At the heart of the Adam and Eve story lies one central proposition. Thomas argues that Earth's history is punctuated by recurring global catastrophes that dramatically reshape the planet's surface and repeatedly interrupt the development of civilization. Unlike the gradual geological processes emphasized by modern geology, Thomas proposes that Earth's history is marked by periodic episodes of sudden, catastrophic change. According to his interpretation, these events occur on a recurring cycle measured not in millions of years, but within intervals that could affect human civilizations. He suggests that entire cultures may have been destroyed within remarkably short periods of time. And the mechanism Thomas proposes centers largely on Earth's magnetic field and the possibility of rapid shifts involving the planet's crust or orientation. He speculates that these events would produce enormous earthquakes, widespread volcanic activity, massive tidal waves, severe climatic disruption, and rapid environmental change. And under such conditions, civilizations dependent upon agriculture, transportation, and stable weather patterns could collapse quickly. Modern geology certainly recognizes that Earth has experienced catastrophic events. For example, large volcanic eruptions have altered global climates. Asteroid impacts have caused mass extinctions, ice ages have dramatically transformed ecosystems, and entire regions have been reshaped by earthquakes, tsunamis, floods, and glacial movement.
An extraordinary claim requires some extraordinary evidence, and let's be clear, claiming that a 6-mile-wide asteroid crashed into the planet, unleashing the power of 1 billion nuclear weapons, is an extraordinary claim. So where is the evidence? Where is the smoking gun? Well, I'm sat in it. This is called a cenote. It's a word that comes from one of the Mayan languages. It literally means hole in the ground filled with water. Now, take a look at this map of this part of Mexico, the Yucatan Peninsula. And when I superimpose the cenotes, you see there's an enormous number of them. The landscape is completely freckled. But then look again in more detail. You see this here? There's an arc of these geological features running across here. And if we complete the arc, turning it into a circle, it has a diameter of 110 miles, which corresponds perfectly with the inner rim of the crater made when the asteroid struck our planet. Now, the cenotes weren't formed at the time. Over millions of years, that impact seems to have weakened the rock here. Water has leached through it, forming cave systems which have collapsed in some places, giving us this ring of cenotes.
Look at the Black Sea. Sandwiched between modern-day Russia, Turkey, and Eastern Europe. Over 7,000 years ago, it was just a freshwater lake. But after the end of the last ice age, ice sheets in North America and across the world melted. Sea levels surged over 300 feet. The Mediterranean overflowed. An estimated 14,000 cubic miles of salt water, 5 times Lake Superior, carving out the Bosphorus Straits and creating this huge inland sea. This is the hotly debated Black Sea Deluge theory.
The seasons in the southern hemisphere are the opposite. Because the tilt of the axis is what makes the seasons, and because there are astronomical forces that change the tilt of the axis and its orientation over time, the result is climate change. There's 3 cycles that affect the Earth's axis, and they're called the Milankovitch cycles after the man who investigated and calculated them correctly for the first time, whose name was Milutin Milankovitch. He was a Serbian applied mathematician and civil engineer. He did this work starting in the 1920s.
Oh, so it's recent. I mean, recent as the
recent.
20th century, yeah.
People began thinking about how astronomical changes could be responsible for the ice ages long before then, but they didn't really have the details right. He got it right.
So the ice ages were a point of suspicion for historians, why we would go in and out of ice ages without any obvious forcing.
Yes. People wonder what was the cause of the ice ages. Right. Could it be changes in the atmosphere of the Earth? Could it be astronomical forces acting on the Earth? The ice age cycles are, the pacemaker of those are these astronomical cycles that were investigated by Milankovitch. So there's the change in the tilt, which is called the obliquity. The tilt of the axis, which is now 23.5 degrees, that wobbles, that goes through an oscillation of about a degree one way to 23.5 degrees. It goes to 24.5 degrees and to 22.5 degrees, back and forth slowly. There's the change in the direction of the axis in space, which has a 26,000-year period. That's called precession.
So while we're spinning, it will
exactly
wobble like that.
Wobble like that. And the period of that wobble is about 26,000 years with respect to the stars. And the third one is there's a change in the shape of the orbit of the Earth. The orbit of the Earth and of the other planets is not perfectly circular. It's elliptical. It's a distorted circle. And the sun is not in the center of that ellipse. It's off from the center. So at one point in the orbit, called perihelion, the Earth is closest to the sun. 6 months later, it's at the opposite end of the orbit. It's farthest from the sun.
In fact, you know what month we're closest?
I'm going to say winter, January. January.
Well, January, yeah. It's the opposite of what many people think.
Right.
Eccentricity, the deviation from being a circular orbit, that itself changes over time due to tugs by the planets, mainly Jupiter and Venus, on the Earth's orbit. And so the eccentricity goes through slow changes with a period of about 100,000 years and another longer period of about 400,000 years. So you add all of this complexity together, and you can calculate how it affects the strength of sunlight across the seasons and across the latitudes of the Earth over time. And you can calculate it pretty exactly because it's just celestial mechanics. It's Newtonian physics that has been perfected. You can calculate it for millions of years into the past and project it millions of years into the future. And this is the pacemaker of the cycles of the ice ages.
So that's Earth's magnetic field. It's relatively weak, okay? It's weak. So if you take a bar magnet, I don't know if anyone still has them, you can do this, tie a string in the middle where it's balanced and just sort of suspend it there. It will slowly line up with Earth's magnetic field.
Okay.
Provided the string is twisty enough so that it can aim where it wants. It'll slowly line up, and the north is going to point north to Earth's south magnetic field. All right. It turns out, as weak-ass as this field is, it's not always at the same strength, nor is it always oriented the same way. The magnetic pole of the Earth flips, and it has flipped many times. At 100% of the times of the occasions where people say, I hear the world is going to end and Earth's axis is going to flip, because they heard something about Earth's axis flipping,
right?
And they think somehow Santa Claus is going to be south instead of north, when what they read about Earth's axis flipping has been entirely related to the magnetic field flipping.
Gotcha.
And not Earth.
So the Earth is not actually tumbling over so that top is bottom and bottom is top.
That has never happened.
That's never happened.
Correct.
What's happening is the actual magnetic field, which is the thing surrounding the Earth, that orientation changes.
Where Thomas departs from mainstream scientific understanding is in the frequency, mechanism, and timing of those proposed global catastrophes. Current geological research does not support the idea of rapid, recurring crustal shifts occurring in the manner he describes, nor does it support periodic global civilization-ending events driven by sudden displacement of the Earth's crust. One aspect of Thomas's theory that deserves additional explanation is that he does not simply argue catastrophes occur, he attempts to explain exactly how they occur. Earlier writers often described enormous floods, sudden extinctions, or dramatic changes in the Earth's surface, but many stop short of identifying a physical mechanism that could produce those events. Thomas believed that he had found one. And according to his interpretation, the process begins over thousands of years as Earth's polar ice caps continue accumulating enormous masses of ice. Because those ice caps are not perfectly centered on the planet's rotational axis, he argues they generate increasing centrifugal forces as the Earth rotates. And under ordinary conditions, Thomas believed that those forces are restrained by the Earth's internal structure. Specifically, he proposes that a shallow molten layer beneath the Earth's crust behaves almost like a solid because the planet's electrical and magnetic properties. Eventually, however, Thomas argues that something disrupts that internal electrical and magnetic balance. He admits he cannot fully identify the trigger, although he briefly considered and later rejected severe solar activity as a possible explanation. Whatever the cause, he proposes that the disruption temporarily allows the shallow molten layer to behave as a true liquid rather than a rigid foundation, and at that point, he argues, the accumulated stresses become overwhelming. The Earth's outer shell rapidly slips over its interior, relocating the geographic poles in a remarkably short period of time. And according to Thomas, while the crust shifts, the atmosphere and the oceans continue moving with their existing momentum. The result, he argues, would be continent-scale winds exceeding 1,000 miles per hour, enormous walls of seawater crossing entire continents, widespread volcanic eruptions as molten material breaks through the crust, massive earthquakes, rapid climate change, and the destruction of nearly every complex civilization on Earth. This proposed mechanism is one of the defining characteristics of the Adam and Eve story. Thomas was not simply suggesting that catastrophes happen. He believed that he had reconstructed the physical processes responsible for them. Modern geophysics does not support this mechanism. Current understanding of plate tectonics, Earth's interior structure, rotational dynamics, and geomagnetism does not indicate that the Earth's crust can suddenly rotate over the mantle in the manner Thomas describes. Even so, understanding his proposed mechanism is important because it forms the foundation upon which the remainder of the book is built. Everything that follows, his interpretation of history, religion, archaeology, and mythology, depends upon the assumption that this catastrophic process has occurred repeatedly throughout human history. Nevertheless, Thomas attempts to build his case by drawing from an extraordinary variety of historical sources. He examines flood traditions found in cultures across the world, the biblical account of Noah, for example, and ancient Near Eastern flood narratives, Greek mythology, stories from indigenous cultures, and legends describing great fires, earthquakes, darkness, and overwhelming floods. Rather than treating these accounts as isolated traditions, Thomas argues that they may represent fragmented memories of real prehistoric catastrophes witnessed by different civilizations. And he extends this reasoning to archaeology. Why do some ancient cities appear abandoned? Why do civilizations sometimes collapse abruptly? And why do megalithic structures survive while other evidence disappears? And to Thomas, these questions suggest recurring interruptions rather than uninterrupted human progress. He also discusses frozen mammoths discovered in Siberia. To him, these remarkably preserved animals implied environmental changes occurring much more rapidly than conventional explanations suggested. Modern paleontology generally explains these discoveries through combinations of rapid burial, freezing conditions, and climate dynamics rather than sudden planetary catastrophe. Even so, Thomas viewed them as supporting evidence for his broader theory. And perhaps the most intriguing aspect of his argument is not any single example, but his method of reasoning. Rather than beginning with one scientific discipline, he attempts to synthesize many different fields into a unified explanation, and each becomes one piece of a much larger puzzle. Recognizing recurring themes across cultures can certainly generate worthwhile questions as well, but similar stories do not necessarily prove a single historical event. For example, independent societies often develop comparable myths in response to common human experiences such as floods and earthquakes, storms, droughts, and the unpredictable forces of nature. And that distinction is important because questions do deserve investigation and patterns deserve examination, but conclusions require evidence proportional to the claims being made. And that principle becomes even more important as Thomas expands his theory beyond geology and into biology, evolution, human behavior, religion, and the future of civilization itself. One of the more unusual aspects of the Adam and Eve story is that Thomas does not limit his discussion to geology or ancient history. As his argument develops, he expands into biology, evolution, medicine, and human psychology, and while exploring his arguments, a point he makes is if periodic global cataclysms repeatedly reshape civilization, then those events should leave traces not only in rocks and ruins, but in living organisms as well. And that's where the book becomes increasingly speculative, because he questions aspects of conventional evolutionary theory, arguing that the history of life may not represent a smooth progression from simple organisms toward increasingly complex forms. Instead, he suggests that catastrophic events repeatedly interrupt biological development, forcing species, including humanity, to recover from periods of severe environmental disruption. And rather than viewing extinction events as isolated episodes separated by millions of years, he proposes that cycles of destruction and recovery are more closely tied to human history than generally accepted by mainstream science. Current evolutionary biology does not recognize that Earth's history includes several mass extinctions. The extinction of the dinosaurs, more than 60 million years ago, is perhaps the best known example, and paleontologists have documented other large-scale extinction events throughout the geological record. Where Thomas departs from scientific consensus is in proposing that these catastrophic cycles occur frequently enough to repeatedly erase advanced civilizations. He also questions whether natural selection alone adequately explains human development, suggesting instead that degeneration may sometimes play as significant a role as advancement. And this perspective leads him into one of the book's most controversial subjects, which is the relationship between Earth's magnetic field and human behavior. Thomas discusses laboratory experiments involving animals exposed to environments with altered magnetic conditions, and he references research suggesting that changes in magnetic fields may influence biological processes, including stress responses, reproduction, and certain psychological functions. From these observations, he advances a broader hypothesis that he proposes that fluctuation in Earth's magnetic field preceding major cataclysms could influence human behavior on a societal scale. And according to Thomas, periods of declining magnetic stability might contribute to increased aggression, declining empathy, social unrest, political instability, and widespread moral deterioration. In his interpretation, civilizations do not simply experience geological warning signs before collapse, they experience psychological warning signs as well. And this becomes one of the recurring themes throughout the later half of the text. He suggests that many societies begin deteriorating internally before catastrophic events occur externally. Whether these developments result from changing magnetic conditions or from ordinary historical cycles remains, of course, a matter of considerable debate. Modern neuroscience and psychology recognize that human behavior is influenced by a complex interaction of genetics, environment, culture, economics, education, nutrition, social relationships, and countless other variables. While researchers continue studying possible biological effects of magnetic fields, there's no broadly accepted scientific evidence supporting Thomas's conclusion that fluctuations in Earth's magnetic field produce the sweeping societal transformations he describes. Thomas frequently begins with observations drawn from real scientific, historical, or archaeological discussions, while also incorporating more speculative interpretations, and from there he extends those ideas well beyond what current evidence supports. Recognizing where observation ends and exploration begins also allows readers to evaluate his arguments more carefully. Nevertheless, these chapters reveal something important about the author's broader philosophy, in that it appears he views civilization as a living system. Just as an ecosystem responds to environmental stress, Thomas appears to believe that societies respond to planetary conditions. In his framework, geology, biology, psychology, politics, and history are not independent subjects, and they're all interconnected. And this systems-oriented perspective helps explain why the book continues attracting readers from such diverse backgrounds, because each finds something different within its pages, because Thomas attempts to connect disciplines that are usually studied separately. And whether those conditions withstand scientific scrutiny is another question, but the ambition of the project itself remains difficult to ignore because Thomas moves beyond science altogether. He enters territory where history, religion, language, and mythology begin merging into a single narrative. Earlier chapters of the book attempted to reinterpret Earth's geological history, and later portions of the Adam and Eve story attempted something even more ambitious, where Thomas begins re-examining some of the oldest religious traditions in human history. And his approach is neither devotional nor openly skeptical. Instead, he treats religious texts as historical records that may preserve fragmented memories of events far older than the civilizations that eventually recorded them. Throughout history, many researchers have suggested that myths and religious narratives sometimes preserve echoes of genuine historical events. Ancient flood traditions provide one example. Volcanic eruptions may inspire stories of divine judgment. Meteor impacts might become legends passed from generation to generation. And Thomas accepts this general premise but extends it much further. Perhaps the most distinctive aspect of Thomas's religious interpretations concern not simply the events described in Genesis, but the text itself. Thomas argues that the earliest versions of the Genesis account were not originally written in Hebrew at all. Instead, he proposes that the stories ultimately preserved in Genesis originated thousands of years earlier within a prehistoric symbolic language. And according to Thomas, this was not an alphabet in the modern sense. Rather, it was a system of symbolic glyphs whose meanings extended far beyond their literal appearance. In this interpretation, many familiar biblical images, including the tree of life, the serpent, and other reoccurring symbols, were never intended to be understood literally. Instead, they represented ideas, civilizations, geographical features, natural forces, or historical events preserved within a symbolic tradition. Thomas argues that as civilizations disappeared through successive catastrophes, the original symbolic meanings were gradually forgotten. Later generations inherited the stories, but no longer understood the language in which they had first been composed. Within this framework, Moses occupies an important role. Thomas suggests that Moses inherited traditions derived from much older sources, but interpreted many of those ancient symbols literally because the original symbolic meaning had already been lost. Centuries later, Thomas further argues that Ezra reconstructed portions of the Hebrew scriptures after earlier records had been destroyed. According to Thomas, each stage of transmission preserved important historical memories while also introducing new misunderstandings as symbolic language gradually became literal history. The result, in his view, is that Genesis contains both authentic memories of prehistoric catastrophes and interpretations added by later civilizations attempting to understand traditions that had already become ancient. Thomas, therefore, does not read Adam and Eve as describing the absolute beginning of humanity. Instead, he interprets the narrative as preserving the memory of people who lived after an earlier global catastrophe, representing the beginning of one civilization rather than the beginning of mankind itself. And whether readers ultimately accept this interpretation or reject it entirely is one thing, but it does represent one of the central ideas of the Adam and Eve story, where Thomas is not merely reinterpreting Genesis, he's attempting to reconstruct what he believes existed before Genesis was written. And he argues that biblical accounts, ancient myths, and archaeological traditions should be viewed collectively rather than independently. One particularly controversial discussion concerns the final words of Jesus recorded in the New Testament. Thomas proposes alternative linguistic interpretations suggesting that certain phrases may have originated from languages or cultural traditions different from those generally accepted by biblical scholarship. He also explores claims connecting Jesus with travel beyond the Roman world, including traditions involving India and other regions of Asia. These ideas have circulated in various forms for more than a century and remain subject to considerable debate among historians and theologians. Mainstream scholars generally find insufficient historical evidence to support such conclusions. Thomas, nevertheless, presents them as part of his larger attempt to reconstruct what he believes is a forgotten history of humanity. And this naturally leads into Thomas's discussion of ancient languages. It would be easy to read these chapters as simply an attempt to demonstrate that various ancient languages share common origins. But that is not really Thomas's primary objective here. His larger argument is that languages preserve historical memory. He appears to believe that symbolic meanings, reoccurring words, and shared mythological imagery can survive long after the civilizations that created them have disappeared. In Thomas's framework, language functions almost like an archaeological artifact. Just as buried cities preserve physical evidence of the past, languages preserve conceptual evidence. According to his interpretation, similarities among ancient languages, including ancient Mayan and Egyptian traditions and other early cultures, suggest fragments of a much older parent civilization whose history was largely erased by repeated catastrophes. And whether modern historical linguistics supports those proposed relationships is a separate question, but the important point for understanding Thomas's methodology is recognizing why he spends so much time discussing language in the first place. For him, it appears that languages are not simply methods of communication, they are repositories of memory. If civilizations repeatedly disappear, Thomas argues written records may be lost, cities may vanish, and monuments may collapse, but stories, symbols, and words may survive, carried forward by later cultures that no longer fully understand their original meanings. And that idea explains why Thomas repeatedly moves between archaeology, mythology, linguistics, and religion. He proposes that each discipline preserves different fragments of the same forgotten history, and only by examining them together can that history be reconstructed. According to his interpretation, linguistic relationships sometimes preserve evidence of much older civilizations whose history have already disappeared. He speculates about connections between distant cultures separated by geography but linked through recurring myths, symbols, and traditions. And again, this reflects his characteristic method. Rather than relying upon one discipline, he attempts to synthesize many, and each becomes another thread woven into a single narrative. He also discusses the Shroud of Turin not simply as a religious artifact, but another piece of a larger historical puzzle. And rather than treating it in isolation, he incorporates it into a broader argument concerning ancient knowledge and the continuity of religious traditions. And perhaps the most speculative sections involve references to angels, advanced beings, and the possibility that ancient descriptions of supernatural encounters may actually represent misunderstood interactions with technologically advanced visitors. Ideas resembling these have appeared in several books exploring what later are referred to as the ancient astronaut hypothesis. And Thomas does not always present these interpretations as definitive conclusions. Often they appear as possibilities he believes deserve consideration. Even so, these chapters move considerably farther from established historical knowledge than earlier discussions of geology or catastrophe. And for readers, this presents an interesting challenge because the further Thomas moves from physical evidence toward symbolic interpretation, the more difficult his arguments become to evaluate objectively. Religious texts operate within literary, theological, and cultural traditions that extend far beyond simple historical reporting, and consequently, separating metaphor from memory becomes increasingly complex and is one of the defining characteristics of the Adam and Eve story. Thomas consistently resists narrow specialization. He refuses to examine geology without history, history without religion, religion without language, and language without archaeology. And by this point in the book, however, Thomas has largely completed his historical reconstruction. The remaining chapters shift towards something much more practical. That if civilizations truly rise and fall through recurring catastrophes, then an obvious question follows. What should individuals do about it? By the final chapters of the Adam and Eve story, Chan Thomas largely shifts away from reconstructing humanity's past and begins asking a more practical question. If civilizations are periodically interrupted by catastrophic events, what should individuals do? This transition is interesting because the tone of the book changes noticeably. Earlier chapters are largely theoretical. Thomas attempts to explain geology, archaeology, mythology, and religion through a single interpretive framework. Later chapters become increasingly practical. He discusses preparedness, food, water, shelter, navigation, geography, astronomy, and family planning. In many respects, these recommendations resemble preparedness advice that has existed for generations, such as know your environment, understand where you live, develop practical skills before emergencies occur, and avoid unnecessary dependence upon fragile systems. These ideas should sound familiar to anyone who has studied general preparedness. Thomas also discusses the importance of location. For example, if catastrophic changes occur, he argues that geography may determine survival. He considers elevation, distance from coastlines, climate, access to water, and agricultural potential. Again, these are practical considerations that appear throughout emergency planning literature. Where Thomas differs is in the scale of the disaster he anticipates. His recommendations assume civilization-wide disruption. Most emergency management professionals instead encourage preparing for the hazards most likely to affect one's own region. The underlying principle, however, remains surprisingly familiar, which is understand your environment before you depend upon it. As the discussion continues, Thomas broadens his critique beyond physical preparedness. He turns towards society itself. He argues that civilizations often display recognizable patterns before collapse. Political institutions become increasingly unstable. Public trust erodes, crime rises, economic systems weaken, government becomes less responsive, and citizens become increasingly divided. Thomas interprets these developments as possible indicators that a civilization has entered the final stages preceding another global catastrophe. And whether those observations represent evidence of approaching geological upheaval is, of course, speculative. History offers many examples of political instability that did not culminate in planetary catastrophe. Likewise, societies have recovered from periods of profound internal conflict without experiencing civilization-ending events. Even so, Thomas raises an interesting historical question. Why do civilizations sometimes fall from within before external events finish the process? And that question extends well beyond his own theories. Historians continue debating the decline of the Roman Empire, for instance, the collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations, the disappearance of the classical Maya, and countless other examples where environmental, political, economic, military, and cultural pressures interacted in extraordinarily complex ways. Thomas proposes one explanation, mainstream scholarship proposes others, but the underlying question remains worthwhile. How resilient is a civilization? Given the speculative nature of many of Thomas's conclusions, an obvious question remains. Why has the Adam and Eve story continued attracting readers more than half a century after it was written? Part of the answer lies in the internet itself. For decades, the book remained relatively obscure. It circulated among readers interested in geology, comparative religion, alternative history, and unconventional scientific theories. Then fragments began appearing online. References to the CIA archive spread rapidly across websites, discussion forums, podcasts, and YouTube channels. The narrative gradually changed, and instead of discussing the book's arguments, many people began discussing the fact that the CIA possessed a copy, and the document itself became secondary, and the story surrounding the document became primary. And this illustrates a fascinating aspect of human behavior in that people are naturally drawn toward information described as hidden, forbidden, suppressed, or secret. Once something acquires that reputation, curiosity often increases dramatically. The existence of official documents often encourages people to assume the underlying claims possess greater credibility than they otherwise might. Sometimes that assumption proves justified. Sometimes it does not. Ultimately, the documents themselves must still be evaluated carefully, because evidence remains evidence regardless of where it's stored. Likewise, unsupported claims remain unsupported, even when they appear within government archives. Another reason the book continues attracting attention is its remarkable ambition. Thomas attempts to answer enormous questions such as where did civilization come from? Why do cultures disappear? How should ancient myths be interpreted? Is history cyclical? And could humanity experience another global catastrophe? Books that ask large questions often remain interesting even when readers disagree with the proposed answers, because they encourage curiosity, they invite comparison with other ideas, and they stimulate discussion. At the same time, they also remind us of an important cognitive tendency that human beings are exceptionally skilled at recognizing patterns. Sometimes those patterns reveal genuine relationships, and sometimes they do not. Psychologists refer to this tendency as pattern recognition, and it has served humanity remarkably well throughout history, whether it's recognizing weather changes, animal behavior, seasonal cycles, or social relationships. These abilities helped our ancestors survive. But the same tendency can also encourage us to connect unrelated events. The challenge, therefore, is maintaining intellectual discipline by continuing to distinguish between observation, interpretation, and conclusion. So where does this leave the Adam and Eve story? After examining its arguments, the answer is more nuanced than either its strongest supporters or its strongest critics sometimes acknowledge. Chan Thomas attempted something remarkably ambitious. He sought to build a single framework capable of explaining geology, archaeology, mythology, religion, biology, ancient history, and the rise and fall of civilizations. Few authors attempt to connect so many disciplines within one work. Whether readers ultimately accept those connections is another matter. Many of his conclusions remain outside current scientific and historical consensus, and some raise interesting questions that continue being explored through ongoing research. Still others belong more appropriately within the realm of speculation than documented history. And history deserves careful study. Science deserves careful examination, and extraordinary claims deserve proportionate evidence. And at the same time, curiosity deserves encouragement. Books that challenge conventional thinking have long played an important role in intellectual history, and sometimes they introduce ideas that later prove influential, or reveal the limits of contemporary knowledge, and sometimes they simply remind us that asking difficult questions remains one of humanity's greatest strengths. Whether the Adam and Eve story is ultimately remembered as speculative history, unconventional research, or an imaginative synthesis of many disciplines, its lasting significance may not lie in the certainty of its conclusions. Instead, it lies in its invitation to think critically about the past, to question how we evaluate evidence, and to recognize that understanding rarely begins with answers. Anyway, that's all I have for this episode. Thank you for listening, and if you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe, rate, or write a review.
There is a signal broadcast every second of every day through our television sets.
Mark my words, AIs are far more dangerous than nukes.
Science and technology are propelling us forward at accelerating rates.
Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%.